And so you have the screen to your right, you have the large screen there to your left, and you have the original paper copy of this State's Exhibit 3. Just want to confirm that all the jurors have copies and when not have copies. Okay. And it appears that everybody does. So can you tell us here, just kind of walk us through this first slide.
Okay, well, this is just setting up for the mapping that will follow, showing that this first series of maps will be directly related to devices I understood to be associated with Mr. Miles Bryant, that being a T-Mobile account, the 678-891-8632, and the Verizon 770-687-6173, which was his work phone. And so the following slides will address that mapping. You'll see there that it says Miles Bryant CSLI. That stands for cell site location information. The phone companies provide a variety of data to us when we request it, and this data was requested with search warrants, and so that gives us the authority to get that information. And this data contained cell site location information, which directly relates to not just the date and the time of an event, but also that tower information that we talked about. So I'm able to take that event, which is the call detail record, and relate it to a location, a geographic location based on that cell site location information.
And ultimately, as you do that, is the goal here to be able to pinpoint to some degree of accuracy where someone is located at when they send or receive a phone call or send or receive a text message or otherwise utilize their phone that connects to a tower?
Yes, this helps us define a geographic area. It doesn't define a specific point definitive to all others. What it gives us is a geographic area to look at and to expect that device to have been in.
All right, the first slide here, just kind of explain, just generally for the jury, what we are looking at here.
Okay, can I stand?
Absolutely.
Okay, and I'll try to speak up so everybody can hear me. But what we have here is, this is a map, a very simple map of that cell site location information for a specific call. And here I've pulled out the call detail record for you. This is an outgoing phone call from Mr. Bryant's device to a 9777 number. And what's important about it is, with this outgoing call, T-Mobile registered that the call was communicated through a tower at this latitude and this longitude, and that azimuth that we talked about was 160 degrees. And so we've set the beam width here to 120 degrees, you'll see. So that breaks our, when we talk about our 360 degree coverage, down to one sector of only 120 degrees. And so that is what this map depicts. Now, I want to orient you to the outer band here at 3 miles. That doesn't mean that it was all the way out here at 3 miles. In fact, this area is in Norcross, and I pulled up a master map of all the towers within about a 3 mile radius of this location, and there were over 20. I think it was about 26 access points through towers. So that tells you that, and the furthest I saw was about 1.5 miles. So in reality, we've got towers all over the place here. So the fact that this phone, while making this phone call, communicated with this tower, means that it's somewhere, likely somewhere within a close proximity to the tower within this coverage area. I've also given you reference points here of Mr. Bryant's apartment on the left here with this point, and then I've given you a reference here to Miss Kelly, and I'm going to mess up the last name.
Pagoda.
Okay, and that's her apartment here on the right. So this is all Windscape Village Lane within that coverage area of this tower.
Right, and the tower that you're actually referencing there, where is that tower located?
It's actually physically located off of Singleton Road, just outside of this neighborhood where these folks live. It's very, very close to the neighborhood.
All right. Now, what is on this particular first slide, the call that you're referencing here, this call detail record, what is the time of, or what time range, if you will, does this map depict?
This is starting at 21:15 hours, which is 9:15 p.m.
Okay, so that call that was made to the number there that's listed, the 9777 number, occurred at 9:15 p.m. on July 26th of 2022?
That's correct.
All right, and the area in which that call was made, it covers the defendant's apartment.
It does.
So if the defendant were at his apartment, it would be consistent with this map,
Yes.
with this tower mapping.
Yes, because his apartment is so close to this tower, I mean, it's very close walking distance. It doesn't surprise me at all that it would hit that tower, that sector, if he was at home.
All right, in fact, we're going to go to the next slide here. Give us a little bit better detail of what you're talking about when it comes to the proximity of the tower to Mr. Bryant's home.
Yeah, so this is a continuation of the last slide. The only thing I've done here is zoom in so that you can see it a little better. And here's the base of the tower. Here's that sector that we talked about, the left and right sides of the sector, Mr. Bryant's apartment and Ms. Kelly's apartment. And I actually went there in preparation for this and GPS these two locations to give you an accurate location for these apartments. And so both of these apartments are within the coverage area of that sector.
Okay. Now, so the almost the entirety of the Sterling Glen Apartments, is it wholly contained within this sector?
Yes, pretty much the entire apartment complex. I mean, it goes a little bit out over here, close to Singleton Road. I would expect that if someone was over here, it might go to this sector north. But the majority of the complex is within that sector.
Talk to us about, as we're looking at this second slide here, I think technically third slide here, we've got the beam width here that you said is 120 degrees, and there's kind of hard lines there, right, that separate this sector on the tower from the other ones. What happens if somebody is on the phone and gets close to the border of this sector, right? What do you expect to see?
Right, so it's depicted here with straight lines. In reality, what happens is there's a blurry area along that edge. It's blurry. And so that if you got really close to that edge, it could possibly roll either way between the two sectors. So you would in order to come up with exactly how this was laid out, you have to have an engineer there at the time that it happened testing that area, which we would never have. So this is the best representation we can give you, understanding that if somebody was really close to the line, it could roll away.
Okay. It still hit off the same tower, but just a different side of that triangle that you described on the top of the tower, a different sector on the tower.
Right.
Okay. The next slide here, describe to us what is going on here.
Okay, so in this slide, I've looked at the next event that occurred on Mr. Bryant's T-Mobile number, 8632. And our next event is at 2140, which is 9:40 p.m. And it is an outgoing phone call again to the 9777 number. And you will see on this one, it has rolled to that other sector that we talked about. So we're on exactly the same tower that we were on in the previous slides, but instead of being on the sector more south, we're on this sector here with that center azimuth down the middle being 40 degrees.
All right. Now, I want to ask you, in your expert opinion, when you compare this slide, this call detail record to the previous one that was made at 9:15 p.m., does it appear that the defendant's phone, has moved locations in order to have this call?
I would believe so. Again, with the caveat that if somebody was, right along that edge there, it could roll either way and be stationary. But generally speaking, when we see a change in sector, or in particular change in tower and sector, we think of movement as a potential possibility.
Now, in this one, you still have on this slide his apartment located or identified there. given his location of his apartment and where the sector of this tower is pointing, is it possible he's in his apartment when this call is made?
No.
All right. So even though, you know, could be close to the line or whatever, you can exclude him being in his apartment by 9:40 p.m.
I would never expect him to physically be inside of his apartment and hit this side of the tower.
All right. I'm going to go to the next slide. We are showing here, and can you describe to the jury what's going on in this?
Yeah, so from 9:40 p.m. until 10:27 p.m., I saw very consistent activity with all of these calls here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 voice calls, all taking place with communication through the tower and sector. That's exactly the same tower and sector from the previous slide. It's just a little bit more distant.
And I want to ask you a few things about this. So the numbers over here on this chart that you have up here next to the map, you have identified the 2429 number there as Synovia Parks' number. Right now, just kind of walk us through with that grid. What's occurring here in each one of these lines?
Right. So what I've done with this document here, this spreadsheet here, this graph, is I've taken the very complex call detail records and cell site location information that we get from the phone company and put it into a format that's more easily viewable, and associated that number as I understood it from the reports on this case.
All right. Now, so here there's obviously the time frame here runs from 9:40 to 10:27.
Right.
That you put on the slide, but the actual individual time of each call, is that documented on that chart?
Yes, the chart demonstrates all the different times that we're talking about and whether it was an outgoing or incoming phone call and who the other party was. And just shows you that all of these calls occurred with this tower sector.
Now, the tower in the sector that we're looking at here, is that the same tower, the same sector that we were looking at in the previous slide?
Yes, it is.
All right. Now, here I want to go through a few things. The very top call here to the 9777 number, that one occurred at 9:40 p.m. and I think it says 9:40 and 35 seconds.
Right.
Is that an outgoing or incoming call?
That's an outgoing call.
Now, all the remaining calls that occurred from 10:12 until 10:27 p.m., are they outgoing or incoming calls?
The remainder are all incoming calls.
Now, there's a column listed as duration. Would you explain to the jury what that means?
Right, so in the records we're given from the phone companies a duration of how long the communication took place, and that's just a demonstration of it. So the ones with 0, I'm assuming there's no connection made. The ones where there's a seconds of time delineated, I would expect that some communication or transaction took place.
All right. And was there, do you see those seconds appear like a voicemail picks up or things like that, or does it require an answer on the phone when you see something like 2 seconds long?
Right, it could be rolling over voicemail.
Okay. The 0216 number that's there, you aware that was his mother's phone number?
I don't know that I was, no.
Okay. There's a location there in the graph that you have, not the graph, the map, excuse me. You have another location icon there that indicates Susanna's phone's final location. Where is that location at?
Yes, so here in the map with this red dot, and it's identified here, so final location. I obtained this information from looking at the investigative report as well.
Now I'm going to go to the next slide, which explains to us what we're looking at here.
This was the graphic image in the bottom right corner that I pulled out of the report regarding where Susanna's phone was seen on Life 360 by witness. And so I've simply mapped that for you here. This is a more close-in view than the previous slide. And again, we're still on the exact same tower that we've been talking about the entire time. We've not moved off that tower. We're still in the exact same sectors in the previous slides.
All right. And is this the same time frame as the previous slide, the 9:40 to 10:27?
Yes, the time frame is exactly the same. This is a drilled-in view from the previous slide.
Right. Now, obviously, I know you told us we can't tell exact location of a phone, but is this slide consistent with the defendant's phone being at the same location as Susanna's phone's final location for that entire period of time, 9:40 to 10:27?
Yes.
Okay. The next slide here, explain to us what we're looking at here.
So I'm just continuing in time with the T-Mobile device for Mr. Bryant, and on this one, at 10:42, I saw two different calls, outgoing and outgoing, at 10:42 in no seconds, and at 10:42 in 9 seconds. And now we've seen something different than we've seen before. This will be the first time that you've seen his device leave that tower that's close to his neighborhood, and it's now moved over to these two towers here. Now we have the latitude and longitude. They're not the same towers. So the fact that it changed towers in such a short duration of time could be an indication of movement. I will tell you that you can also see here just how close towers are in this area. They're very close together, so it's quite possible that stationary as well. So I can't say for a fact that there's movement in this slide, but it's possible.
All right. Now, in terms of this slide compared to these calls, compared to the previous calls, the 9:40 to 10:27 calls, all the ones that were listed previously, in these slides, because they're on different towers, can you conclude anything?
I would expect him to have definitely moved away from his home if he was there, because that tower is so close, he's likely to have a very, very strong signal for that tower. I would expect it to be somewhere further away from his residence area.
Does the change in tower locations here from the previous calls from 9:40 to 10:27, does the change in towers indicate generally movement in the direction towards these towers?
Yes, I mean, I would expect, because we've changed towers completely, I would expect there to have been some kind of movement away. Again, I can't say for a fact how much movement there was, if any, but it's an indicator that could be indicative of that.
Okay. Now, both of these towers, do they cover the area, again, where Susanna's phone was located? Or not located, but the indication was where it was at?
Yes, these towers and sectors could also cover that area.
All right. To the next slide here, what are we looking at?
So we're moving forward in time with Mr. Bryant's T-Mobile number still, and we're now looking at 10:46 p.m. through 11:09 p.m., and we have two events that occurred on his phone, one at 10:46 p.m. and one at 11:09 p.m. Both events are incoming voice calls from Ms. Parks, and both events registered at this tower here, which is off of near Pleasant Hill Road, near Club Drive. So we've now passed the tower that's very close to his residence. We've passed the two previous towers that we talked about in the previous slide, and now it's gone to a tower on the other side. So to me, this very much looks like movement.
All right. The next slide here, can you explain, please, what's going on?
Now we're looking at 11:09 to 11:41 with the T-Mobile account, and once again, we're not on the tower from the previous call. The tower from the previous call was here. But what we've done is we've changed sectors. And so we're now on a sector with a 40-degree azimuth for two events at 11:09 and 35 seconds and 11:41 and 13 seconds. Both are outgoing phone calls to two different people, one to Ms. Parks and one to another person. But we've changed sectors. So this sector is not indicative of him being around or near Susanna's phone's last location.
Okay, so in this slide, one of the things, can you conclude that by 11:09 p.m., the defendant's phone had definitively moved away from and outside of the area where Susanna's phone was last known to be.
Yes, that's a valid conclusion.
Okay. The next slide here, would you describe to us what we're looking at?
Okay, continuing on with Mr. Bryant's T-Mobile account, we're now at 11:47 p.m. with this call. It's an outgoing phone call, and it has communicated with a tower that's associated with Beaver Ruin Road. His phone registered on this tower previously. We saw it on a previous slide. So this to me is indicative of him, the device having moved back towards the area of the phone from Miss Susanna and back towards the area of his apartment potentially. I'm not saying they went there. I'm just saying it's going back in that direction because on the previous one, remember we were over here. So some kind of movement has taken place back in that direction by 11:47. And then after midnight at 12:07 a.m., we've moved even further southwest to where we're registering with this tower here on a 40-degree azimuth, consistent with, like I say, here's Jimmy Carter Boulevard area, here's Singleton Road. So it's indicative to me that it's likely moved even possibly a little bit further south. But we see that we do have this overlapping area here. So it would be consistent with him being in this area potentially too as well.
Okay. And then after, on the next slide here, describe to us what we're looking at.
Okay, we're looking at the next events through from 12:23 a.m. to 12:28 a.m. So this is a 5-minute period of time in the phone record. And what I saw during that 5-minute period of time was something at 12:23 a.m. It's an outgoing call to Ms. Parks. At 12:25 a.m., it's an outgoing call to Ms. Parks. And then by 12:28 a.m., it's an outgoing phone call to this 1707 number, who I'm not familiar with. So at 12:23 a.m., the phone is in this sector here. By 12:25, it's in this sector here. And by 12:28, it's in this sector here. This is very indicative of movement.
Tell us
Over
why.
that 5-minute period. Because it's impossible for somebody, because at 12:23 to 12:25, the device is communicating with these towers on these sectors. It would not be possible at all for him to still be here and communicate by 12:28 on this tower sector. It's just not possible. So it's indicative of having moved towards that way. Because remember, we've got a date and time stamp, right? So we know at 12:23 where the device is generally, and for it to be over here 5 minutes later, indicative of movement.
All right. The area generally where these these call detail records are showing, what is the area generally?
Okay, so this is obviously the center of Lawrenceville. We're actually right about here, right now. So this would cover an area consistent with 316. We have 316 covered in both of, or excuse me, all three of these events could cover Highway 316. You see here that this is 12:23, 12:25. The device is somewhere likely a little west of Gwinnett Medical Center or Northside Medical now. But by 12:28, it's an area you see here where the county airport's included, but it's along that 316 corridor is a quite possible explanation for where that device could have been.
Okay. I'm going to go back one slide. The ones you previously testified on the previous slide, the phone calls occurred at 11:47, 12:07 p.m.
Right.
So the last call on this slide occurs at 12:07 p.m. And the next phone call that you, in the records that you were able to map, occurred at 12:23.
Correct.
All right, so that's a difference of how many minutes?
16?
16 minutes. Are you familiar with Gwinnett County? Being
Yes.
a law enforcement officer in it for 26 years?
Yes.
The area off of Jimmy Carter Boulevard, where and that area of Norcross, where the defendant's phone was at 12:07, and the area 16 minutes later over just outside of Lawrenceville here. Do you have any idea how far away those two are?
5 to 10 miles at least.
All right. Now, let me ask you, in terms of the time or distance to travel that, in 16 minutes, is that also indicative to you of movement of the defendant's phone?
Yeah, very much so. It's a large distance and for a device in our area because there's so many towers. And it's not lost on me either when I looked at that the time of day. We're after midnight, so would there have been rush hour traffic? No rush hour traffic. I don't know what was going on over there that night, but I know generally my experience with that time I think it's generally open.
Is it possible to get from Jimmy Carter Boulevard up to Lawrenceville on Interstate 85 and Highway 316 within that period of time?
Yes.
Okay. The next slide, what are we looking at here?
So the next events that I saw in the T-Mobile account records occurred at 12:52 a.m. and 12:58 a.m. At 12:52, his device received an incoming phone call from Ms. Parks. And at 12:58, his device received an incoming phone call from Ms. Parks. Both of these phone calls transpired through a tower and sector here in what I would describe as the Dacula area of the county. You have your latitude and longitude here at the bottom. And I've depicted, because I had the data for where her remains were ultimately found in the report, I've plotted that for you as well with this red dot here, which I think our next slide will drill it a little closer, just shows you the relationship between that tower sector and where her remains were found. And what I've also included in this map is to give you some distance reference material. So I have measured here the distance between the phone's final resting location, Susanna's phone's final location, straight line distance to where the tower and sector is for these calls and how they communicated. And it's just under 18 miles apart.
That's straight line distance. Obviously, if you're going to drive from one location to another, is it greater than 18 miles?
Yes, it would be a mile or two more at least, yes.
Okay. Now, the last call that you had plotted at 12:28 a.m., just looks like north of Lawrenceville in the airport area.
Right.
After that, the next communication or record on the phone, Mr. Bryant's phone, was 24 minutes later, and it was in Dacula.
Right, it would have been, so the last slide had the device somewhere here, around the airport. So we've moved, the device has clearly moved east.
All right. Now, the area, and I'm going to go to the next slide here. What are we looking at?
So this is a close depiction of the previous slide. And what I've given you here again is that geographic reference point for remains and where they were found. And this is that same tower and sector from the previous phone calls that we talked about. This is a more direct depiction of it. And what I've also shown here is how close the remains are to that tower and sector. So if the device had been in or around where the remains were found, that's very consistent with the data in the phone.
Okay. And the area there that we're looking at, and give a bigger overview here, this area, I went back one slide for the record, but this area here that we're looking at, they're right near the tower. Is that an area that's right off of Highway 316?
Yes.
Okay. And in terms of the slide, the coordinates that you've already mapped, the records that you've already mapped, are these records consistent with the defendant's phone having traveled down Highway 316 all the way into Dacula to this location?
Yes, the records are consistent with that scenario.
Okay. Could we go here to the next slide? What are we looking at here?
And so going forward, we're continuing to look at Mr. Bryant's T-Mobile phone. And after the previous calls, the only thing we see, there's about a 2-hour time frame where on this device, we don't see any more activity, but the next activity is at 2:42 a.m. And it's in this location here, this latitude and longitude. And this is an outgoing call to Ms. Parks again. But by this time, he's back communicating with that same tower and sector that is most associated with his address that we talked about in the very beginning. This is back on that same tower and sector from, I believe, the first slide I showed you. So this is consistent with him being back home.
Okay. And that's by 2:42 a.m. Now we're on the next, we're still on the next day, July 27th.
Yes, so this is 2:42 a.m. and yes, next morning, so early a.m. hours on the 27th.
So from your review of his phone records on his T-Mobile phone, his personal phone, there were no other communications with geographic coordinates between 12:58 a.m. and 2:42 a.m.?
Right.
Okay. All right, and show us what we're looking at in this slide.
So this is 3:04 through 3:46 a.m. on the 27th, and we see a series of 3 activities on the device. Outgoing phone call at 3:04, outgoing phone call at 3:37, and an outgoing phone call at 3:46. 2 of these, the first one and the last one, are outgoing phone calls to Ms. Parks. So previously, we referenced that tower and sector that was very consistent with Mr. Bryant's address. These phone calls don't take place on that same tower and sector. The communication has moved over to a new tower and a new sector by 3:04 to 3:46. So we've moved, devices, it's clearly moved in some way north or west of his address, if it was there before.
All right. And the next slide that we're looking at here.
So the following AM hours past that are 9:35 a.m. and 9:43 a.m. So we're daylight the next morning by the time of this mapping. And so here you have activity at 9:35 a.m. on the 27th. What was interesting to me about this was this communication, which is an incoming phone call to his device, is registering with the tower and sector that is, again, consistent with where Ms. Susanna's remains were found at 9:35 a.m. But by 9:43, approximately 8 minutes later, our outgoing phone call to this 0216 number has registered with a tower and a sector here, west of that location. So that would indicate to me that the device has clearly moved from an area consistent with the remains to an area west of that location.
Back in the direction of his home?
Yes, if he were traveling back home, that would be consistent with that.
All right. Now, when you've reviewed his records in total that you've shown us so far, are these records consistent with his phone having traveled from his home in Norcross all the way to Dacula over the night hours of the 26th, back to his home in Norcross in the early morning hours, and then back out to Dacula to the same area where her remains were located by 9:35 a.m. the next morning?
Yes, if that scenario occurred, this digital evidence would support that.
Okay. I'm going to go to the next slide here and ask you what we're looking at here.
This is a different set of phone records. We've now, on this slide, moved to that second phone number that we talked about on the first slide, which is a Verizon number. And what I found was during the time period that we've been talking about today, there were 2 phone calls that were in that time period. One was at 9:39 a.m. and one was at 1:46 a.m. on the 27th. So the early morning hours.
Investigator Wilbanks, I'm going to stop you because I might have misheard you. And the time, did you say it was 9:39 a.m.?
Oh, I'm sorry, 1:39 a.m. I did, that's from 1:39 a.m. to 1:46 a.m. So this information shows that on this device, these two activities, at 1:39 a.m., there's an outgoing phone call to Ms. Parks. At 1:46 a.m., 1:27, there's an outgoing phone call again to Ms. Parks. What's interesting about this is, although in the previous slide we were talking about a T-Mobile phone, this time we're talking about a Verizon phone. So we're talking about two different networks, two different completely different companies, different sets of records, but they both have some information that's consistent with each other. In the previous one, I think we were just shy of about 1 a.m. when his T-Mobile records placed it on this tower and sector, and the Verizon records do the same thing. And that's not inconsistent with what we know about phone companies, because even though you have one tower, you can have multiple companies using the same tower, so they might each have their equipment on that tower. So even though the records are different, it again is a geographical area consistent with where Savannah remains.
So, and I'm going to go to the next slide. Is it go to the next slide? There we go. The next slide here.
Yeah, again, this shows you, even though we're talking about two different companies, they very consistently show you the same thing. This is tower base here. The base station is about less than a half mile, about 4/10 of a mile from where the remains was.
So based on your review and mapping of the records, both of Mr. Bryant's personal phone was located in this area at 12:52 a.m. and 12:58 a.m. on July 27th,
Yes.
where covering the area where Susanna's body was found.
Yes.
And then his work phone was at 1:39 and 1:46 a.m. was in the same area still as the previous calls.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I want to take you. There we go. All right. I kind of change gears here. Show us what we're looking at here.
Okay, so the next set of slides after this one will be graphic depictions of Ms. Parks' cell site location information for her 2429 number, which is an AT&T number. So I pulled those records up to see what I could tell about where she would have been that night.
All right, and show us what we're looking at here.
Okay, so what it shows is for all activity between 10:12 p.m. on the 26th and 11:10 p.m. on the 26th, all activity on that device transpired on these towers here, in these sectors here, which are in and around the area of Mr. Bryant's apartment, with the first event occurring at 10:12 p.m. outgoing phone call to Mr. Bryant, and ending with an 11:10 p.m. incoming phone call from Mr. Bryant.
All right. And because I don't like unanswered questions, is there any significance to the change in color from Mr. Bryant's records that were, purple to the green?
Yeah, that's just so visually you understand we're on a different person, and because there will be a slide or two where I put both of them on there, so you're going to need to tell which one we're talking about. So for Ms. Parks, I made her second green.
All right. The next slide here, what are we looking at?
Okay, so now we're going to go from 12:52 to 12:58 a.m. You will remember that at the time these calls were made, we talked about these previously in Mr. Bryant's records. At the time these calls were made, you'll remember that this phone was in the area of this tower and sector consistent with the remains where they would be found. But at the time those calls were made, Ms. Parks was communicating with these towers and these sectors here, more towards the Norcross Duluth area. So what we have here is 12:52 a.m. device started on this tower, this sector here, this lower one, it ended, that call ended at 12:53 a.m. and then moved over to a new tower sector here. And by 12:58 a.m., it had moved to a different tower in a different sector, a little northeast of there. This is consistent with that device also having moved, but is not at all consistent with Ms. Park's device being in or around the scene or where the body would have been, or where the remains were ultimately found.
The next slide.
So we're continuing with her device now. You will remember also we talked about these calls as well. These are the calls to Mr. Bryant's Verizon account. And so I've simply put these in graphic depiction for you because we know that event took place with his records. We confirm now it also registered with her records. And so we have the 1:39 a.m. call, registering this tower and sector and here, which is consistent with the Doraville area, which is nowhere near where the remains would ultimately be found. And we have the next event at 1:55 a.m. It has moved to a different tower and sector. Again, that's consistent with the movement of her device, but in no way consistent with being at or around the area where the remains.
All right, and last